The dust clouds on Zirion 7 swirled in angry red spirals across the horizon, painting the sky the color of dried blood. Sergeant Marcus Chen wiped the sweat from his forehead and checked his scanner again. The stellar storm was moving faster than the weather satellites had predicted. What was supposed to be a calm 3-day evacuation had turned into a desperate race against time. The refugee camp stretched out before him like a small city of makeshift shelters and emergency supply stations. Thousands of beings from dozens of different worlds moved in organized lines toward the massive transport ships that would carry them to safety. The air buzzed with the sound of alien languages mixing together, creating a strange music that Marcus had grown used to during his 5 years serving with the Galactic Coalition's Humanitarian Corps. Marcus adjusted his medical pack and walked along the main processing line, watching the different species with the trained eye of someone who had seen evacuations go both smoothly and terribly wrong. The tall bird-like Threnody moved with careful precision, their feathered heads turning constantly as they calculated and recalculated the best paths to the ships. Their children stayed close to their parents, making soft chirping sounds that reminded Marcus of Earth sparrows. Near the medical station, a group of Corvank soldiers supervised the loading of heavy equipment onto the cargo transports. The Corvanks looked like walking tanks, their thick gray skin marked with battle scars and their forearms making quick work of tasks that would require teams of other species. They moved with military efficiency, treating the evacuation like any other mission. Marcus respected their professionalism, even if their cold approach sometimes made him uncomfortable. The Miralans were easier to spot because of their bright blue skin and the way they seemed to float rather than walk. As natural empaths, they could sense the emotions of everyone around them, which made them excellent negotiators but also meant they often became overwhelmed in stressful situations like this one. Marcus watched as several Miralan adults pressed their hands to their temples, clearly struggling with the wave of fear and anxiety that filled the camp. But it was the Zilani who caught Marcus's attention most often. They looked almost like living statues made of blue crystal, their translucent skin showing patterns of light that changed with their emotions. Right now, every Zilani in the camp displayed the same pattern. Quick flashes of yellow and orange that Marcus had learned meant stress and worry. They moved in perfect order, never pushing or crowding, but their skin told the story of their fear. Marcus had been working with alien species long enough to appreciate how different they all were, not just in appearance but in the way they thought and acted. The Threnody planned everything down to the smallest detail. The Corvanks followed orders without question. The Miralans felt everything so deeply that they sometimes couldn't act at all. The Zilani used logic and reason to solve problems, keeping their emotions carefully controlled. Humans, Marcus often thought, were somewhere in the middle of all of them. Not as smart as the Threnody, not as strong as the Corvanks, not as sensitive as the Miralans, and not as logical as the Zilani. But maybe that balance was exactly what made them useful in situations like this. A commotion near the main checkpoint caught his attention. Marcus walked over to see what was happening, his medical training making him automatically scan for signs of injury or illness. What he found instead was something he had never encountered in all his years of service. A young Zilani woman stood at the checkpoint, holding something small against her chest. Her skin patterns were chaotic, flashing between colors so quickly that Marcus couldn't read them. The other Zilani in line had moved away from her, their own patterns showing distress and confusion. The woman was holding a baby. Marcus had seen Zilani children before, but never an infant this young. The baby was no bigger than his hand, its crystalline skin shifting between colors in rapid, unpredictable patterns. But what made everyone step back was the sound it was making. The infant's cries were unlike anything Marcus had ever heard. They started as a high-pitched keening that seemed to cut through every other sound in the camp, then dropped to a low wail that made his bones ache. The sound seemed to affect every Zilani within hearing distance. Their skin patterns became more agitated and several adults pressed their hands to their ears. Lieutenant Corvin, the Corvank's officer in charge of the checkpoint, clicked his mandibles in annoyance. "The creature is disturbing the evacuation process," he rumbled in his deep voice. "Can the female not control its vocalizations?" The young Zilani woman, Marcus guessed she was the baby's mother, looked up at the towering Corvanx with patterns of desperation flickering across her skin. "I have tried everything," she said through her translator device. "Nothing calms him. The journey has been too much stress for one so young." A Threnody official consulted his data tablet. "Perhaps the infant requires medical attention," he suggested, in his precise way of speaking. "However, our medical staff reports no knowledge of Zalani infant care." Dr. Yees, one of the Miralan medics, approached but stopped several meters away. "I apologize," she said, her blue skin showing pale spots of distress. "The child's emotional output is too intense. I cannot get close enough to examine him without becoming overwhelmed." More beings had gathered to watch, but none stepped forward to help. Marcus noticed that even the other Zalani kept their distance. The mother's skin patterns were becoming more frantic by the minute, and the baby's cries seemed to be getting louder and more distressed. Lieutenant Corvin checked his chronometer. "We have a schedule to maintain," he announced. "If the infant cannot be quieted, they will need to wait for the next transport." The mother's skin flashed bright red, a color Marcus had never seen on a Zalani before. "There may not be another transport," she said, her voice barely controlled. "The storm is approaching faster than predicted," Lieutenant Corvin agreed with typical Corvanx bluntness, "which is why we cannot delay the evacuation for one individual." Marcus watched as the other species in line began to murmur among themselves. The Threnody calculated the risk to the group versus the individual. The Miralans felt the mother's pain but were too overwhelmed by the baby's emotional distress to act. The remaining Corvanx saw only a logistical problem that needed to be solved efficiently. The baby's cries intensified, and Marcus saw something that made his chest tighten. The mother was looking around desperately, her skin patterns showing that she was considering staying behind rather than disrupting the evacuation for everyone else. Marcus had seen this before, not with aliens, but with human refugees in crisis zones back on Earth. A parent so desperate to protect others that they were willing to sacrifice themselves and their child. It was a kind of selfless terror that transcended species. Without really thinking about it, Marcus stepped forward. "Wait," he said, raising his hand. The group turned to look at him with various expressions of curiosity and confusion. Lieutenant Corvin's mandibles clicked impatiently. "Sergeant Chen," the Corvanx officer said, "unless you have medical expertise. In Zalani infant physiology, I suggest—" "I don't," Marcus interrupted, which was unusual for him. He generally respected the chain of command, but something about this situation made him speak up. "But I have experience with babies. Human babies." The Threnody official tilted his feathered head. "Human infants are physiologically different from Zalani offspring," he pointed out with scientific precision. "Maybe," Marcus said, walking closer to the mother and child. "But crying is crying, right? And babies cry for reasons. They're hungry, or uncomfortable, or scared, or they need comfort." He paused, listening to the infant's wails. "This little one sounds scared to me." The Zalani mother looked at him with an expression he couldn't read, her skin patterns shifting to colors he didn't recognize. Around them, representatives of multiple species watched with interest as the human soldier approached a problem that had stumped all of them. Marcus stopped just a few feet away from the mother and child, close enough to see the baby clearly, but far enough away that he didn't seem threatening. The infant was indeed tiny, its crystalline skin beautiful even in distress. But Marcus's attention was caught by something else, a pattern in the baby's cries that reminded him of something familiar. "Ma'am," he said gently to the mother, "would you mind if I tried something? I promise I won't hurt your baby. I just want to see if I can help." The Zalani mother stared at Marcus for a long moment, her crystalline skin shifting through patterns that seemed to show both hope and fear. Around them, the crowd of different alien species watched with growing curiosity. Marcus could feel their eyes on him, some doubtful, others simply interested in what the human thought he could do. "You may try," the mother said finally, her translator making her voice sound formal and careful. "But please understand, no non-Zalani has ever handled one of our young. I do not know what will happen. Marcus nodded slowly, keeping his movements gentle and non-threatening. He had learned during his years with the Coalition that sudden movements could be misinterpreted by different species. What looked friendly to a human might seem aggressive to someone else. "What's your name?" he asked, the mother as he stepped a little closer. "I am called Silthera," she replied, her skin pattern showing a brief flash of blue that Marcus thought might be surprised at the personal question. "I'm Marcus," he said with a small smile. "And what's your little one's name?" "Kryth, Silthera," said, and her skin showed warmer colors when she spoke her child's name. "He is only 47 days old. This is his first journey away from our homeworld." Marcus looked down at baby Kryth, who was still crying, but seemed to be watching the human with curious eyes. The infant's skin was shifting through colors rapidly, reds and oranges that Marcus had learned meant distress, but also occasional flickers of other shades he didn't recognize. 47 days, Marcus repeated thoughtfully. That's pretty young for such a big trip. He crouched down so he was closer to eye level with Silthera, making himself less intimidating. "You know, human babies that age cry a lot too. It's how they communicate with us." Lieutenant Corvin clicked his mandibles impatiently. "Sergeant Chen, we do not have time for—" "Just give me a minute," Marcus said, without taking his eyes off the baby. He was listening carefully to Kryth's cries, trying to pick up on patterns. During his medical training, he had done rotations in pediatric wards on Earth, and one of the first things they taught you was that different cries meant different things. Kryth's wails were definitely scared, but there was something else. The pitch would rise and fall in a rhythm that seemed almost musical. Marcus found himself unconsciously swaying slightly as he listened, the way he had seen his sister do with her own children. "Silthera," Marcus said gently, "has he been eating normally? Sleeping?" The Zelani woman's pattern shifted to what Marcus thought might be embarrassment. The transport ship was very loud. The engines frightened him. He has not rested well in 2 days. "Ah," Marcus said with understanding. "So, he's tired and stressed just like any baby would be." He looked up at the crowd of aliens watching them. "You know, this isn't really that different from human infants." Dr. Yis, the Miralyn medic, took a cautious step closer. "But the emotional intensity," she said, her blue skin showing pale spots of concern, "it is much stronger than human children produce." "Maybe," Marcus agreed. "But the basic need is the same. He wants comfort. He wants to feel safe." Marcus looked back at Silthera. "Would you mind if I tried holding him? I know it's unusual, but I promise I'll be very careful." The suggestion caused a stir among the watching aliens. Several Zelani in the crowd moved closer, their skin patterns showing intense interest mixed with concern. Marcus could hear them communicating in their own language, rapid musical tones that his translator couldn't quite keep up with. An elderly Zelani male approached, his crystalline skin showing deep blue patterns that Marcus had learned, indicated age and wisdom. "Young mother," he said to Silthera in careful galactic standard, "this is unprecedented. No outsider has ever—" "I know, Elder Thymos." Silthera interrupted, her pattern showing respectful but determined colors. "But my child suffers, and this human offers help. Should I refuse because it has never been done before?" Elder Thymos studied Marcus with ancient eyes that seemed to glow from within his crystal face. "You understand, human, that Zelani infants are not like your young. They are sensitive to emotions, to thoughts, to the intentions of those who hold them." Marcus nodded seriously. "I understand it's a big responsibility, but I also understand that right now Kryth needs help, and maybe I can provide it." The elder was quiet for a moment, then gestured with one translucent hand. "Show us your intentions, human. Let us see your mind." Marcus wasn't sure what that meant, but he closed his eyes and tried to project the same feelings he would have toward any frightened child. Gentleness, patience, a desire to comfort and protect. He thought about his nephew back on Earth, how small and fragile he had felt the first time Marcus held him. When Marcus opened his eyes, he saw that Elder Thymos' skin was showing different patterns, softer colors that seemed almost approving. "Your intentions are pure," the elder said with surprise in his voice. "There is no desire to harm, no curiosity to study, only the wish to help." He looked at Silthara. "The choice is yours, young mother." Silthara looked down at her crying baby, then back at Marcus. Her skin showed the rapid patterns of someone making a difficult decision. Finally, she stepped forward. "Please," she said simply. "Help him." Marcus moved very slowly, letting Silthara guide his hands to the right position. Baby Creath was surprisingly warm and his crystalline skin felt smooth and delicate. The moment Marcus's hands touched the infant, something interesting happened. Creath's cries didn't stop, but they changed. The desperate, panicked quality faded, slightly, replaced by what sounded more like the ordinary fussing of an overtired baby. His skin patterns also shifted, the harsh reds and oranges softening to more muted shades. "That's it," Marcus murmured softly, instinctively beginning the gentle swaying motion that seemed to be programmed into every human who had ever held a baby. "You're okay, little one. You're safe." The crowd around them had grown larger, with representatives from multiple species pushing closer to see what was happening. Marcus could hear whispered conversations in various languages, but he focused on the baby in his arms. Creath was still crying, but Marcus could tell he was beginning to calm down. The infant's eyes, large and multifaceted like jewels, were fixed on Marcus's face with obvious curiosity. Marcus began to hum softly, a lullaby his mother had sung to him years ago on Earth. The effect was immediate and surprising. Creath's cries faded to soft whimpers, and his skin began showing colors that Marcus had never seen before, gentle purples and greens that seemed to pulse in rhythm with Marcus's humming. "Incredible," Elder Themos whispered, his own patterns, showing amazement. "Those are contentment colors. I have never seen them on an infant so young." Dr. Yis stepped closer, her empathic abilities apparently no longer overwhelmed by the baby's emotional state. "The intensity has decreased significantly," she reported. "But more than that, the emotional quality has completely changed. Where before there was fear and distress, now there is curiosity, comfort." Lieutenant Corvin, despite his impatience with the delay, was watching with obvious fascination. "How is this possible?" he rumbled. "Human parental behaviors should not affect a Zilani infant." Marcus continued swaying and humming, finding that Creath responded well to both. The baby had stopped crying entirely now and was making soft cooing sounds that seemed to relax all the Zilani in the area. "Maybe it's not about being human or Zilani," Marcus said quietly, not wanting to disturb the baby's calm state. "Maybe. Babies are babies, no matter what species they are. They need the same basic things: food, warmth, comfort, someone to make them feel safe." A Threnodi scientist had appeared at the edge of the crowd, furiously taking notes on a data tablet. "Fascinating hypothesis," he muttered. "Cross-species parental instinct adaptation. The implications for child psychology across the galaxy could be enormous." Silthara was staring at her son with wonder. Her skin showed patterns that Marcus was beginning to recognize as joy and relief. "He has not been this calm since we left our homeworld," she said softly. "How did you know what to do?" Marcus smiled down at the now peaceful infant. "I didn't really. I just did what felt right, what I would do for any scared baby." He looked up at the crowd of fascinated aliens surrounding them. "I think maybe parents everywhere have more in common than we realize." As if to prove his point, Creath yawned, a tiny sound that was somehow universal in its meaning, and his skin settled into the soft, steady patterns that Elder Themos had identified as contentment. The baby's eyes began to close, finally ready for the sleep he had been denied for days. The crowd watched in amazed silence as a human soldier gently rocked an alien infant to sleep, proving that some languages needed no translation at all. Word spread through the evacuation camp like wildfire. Within an hour of Marcus successfully calming baby Creath, beings from dozens of species had gathered around the checkpoint to witness what many were calling impossible. the human soldier, found himself at the center of attention in a way that made him deeply uncomfortable. But every time he tried to step back, another situation would arise that required his help. The first new crisis came from the Threnody section of the camp. A family of the bird-like beings approached Marcus with obvious desperation in their precise, measured steps. The father, whose feathers were a deep brown color that Marcus had learned indicated high stress, carried a young Threnody who couldn't have been more than the equivalent of a human toddler. "Please," the father said through his translator, his normally perfect pronunciation showing signs of strain. "We have heard what you did for the Zelani child. Our daughter Pipthira has been making distress calls for 6 hours. The transport ships cannot launch while she continues. Her calls interfere with the communication systems." Marcus looked at the small Threnody child, who was indeed producing a series of high-pitched chirps and whistles that seemed to cut through every other sound in the area. Her feathers were standing up all over her body, making her look twice her normal size, and her large eyes were wide with obvious fear. "What's wrong with her?" Marcus asked, automatically shifting into the gentle tone he had used with Krythe. The mother stepped forward, her own feathers showing the ruffled patterns of exhaustion. "She has never been away from our nest tree before. The open sky, the strange smells, the noise of the engines, everything frightens her. We cannot make her understand that we are trying to keep her safe." Marcus studied the child thoughtfully. Threnody were very different from Zelani, but some things seemed universal. Fear was fear, no matter what species experienced it. "Can I try something?" he asked. The parents exchanged glances, their feathers rippling in what Marcus thought might be hope mixed with uncertainty. "You may try," the father said finally. "But please understand Threnody young imprint on specific sounds and movements. What works for one species may not work for another." Marcus knelt down so he was at eye level. With little Pipthira, her distress calls were incredibly loud up close, but he noticed they followed a pattern. 3 sharp chirps, followed by 2 longer whistles, then a pause before starting again. It reminded him of a child calling for help. "Hey there, little bird," Marcus said softly, using the same gentle tone that had worked with Krythe. "You're scared, aren't you? This is all very different from home." Pipthira stopped her calls for a moment, tilting her head to study this strange being who was talking to her. Marcus saw his opportunity and began to whistle softly, trying to mimic the rhythm of her distress calls, but in a calmer, lower pitch. The effect was immediate. Pipthira's feathers began to settle against her body, and her calls became quieter and less frantic. Marcus continued whistling, gradually slowing the rhythm and making it more musical, the way he might sing a lullaby. Dr. Lysiandra, an elderly Zelani researcher who had been observing Marcus's work with great interest, approached with her data tablet in hand. "Remarkable," she murmured, her crystalline skin showing patterns of scientific fascination. "You are instinctively adapting your approach to each species' specific needs." Marcus didn't stop whistling, but he nodded slightly. He was beginning to understand that while the techniques might be different, the underlying principles were the same. Every frightened child, regardless of species, needed to feel safe and understood. As Pipthira finally settled into quiet, sleepy chirps, another commotion arose from the Corvanks section of the camp. Marcus looked up to see Lieutenant Corvin, himself approaching, followed by several adult Corvanks who were clearly struggling with something. "Sergeant Chen," Lieutenant Corvin said, his deep voice showing an unusual note of frustration. "We have a situation with our juveniles. They are becoming increasingly aggressive due to the stress of evacuation. 3 fights have broken out in the last hour." Marcus looked over at the group of young Corvanks who were indeed showing signs of agitation. They were smaller than the adults but still formidable, their thick gray skin marked with the bright red patterns that indicated battle readiness. They were pushing each other, making threatening gestures, and producing the low growling sounds. That meant they were preparing to fight. "Corvank's juveniles respond to dominance displays," Lieutenant Corvin explained. "But none of us can establish proper dominance without risking injury to the young ones. They are too agitated to listen to reason." Marcus studied the young Corvanks thoughtfully. This was different from the fear responses he had dealt with so far. These children weren't scared. They were frustrated and looking for an outlet for their energy. He thought about human children who acted out when they were stressed or bored. What if we gave them something else to focus on? Marcus suggested. Something that uses their energy but isn't destructive. He walked over to the group of juveniles who immediately turned their attention to him. Marcus was much smaller than any Corvanx, which put him at a disadvantage in terms of physical dominance. But he had learned something important during his years of service. Confidence was often more important than size. "Hey," Marcus said firmly, using his command voice. "You want to fight? Fine. Let's see how strong you really are." The juveniles stopped growling and looked at him with curiosity. Marcus picked up a piece of debris from the evacuation, a heavy, metal container that would have been difficult for a human to lift. "Can any of you carry this to the transport ship over there?" he asked, pointing to a ship about 50 meters away. The challenge immediately caught their attention. Corvanx culture was built around tests of strength and endurance, and the juveniles responded exactly as Marcus had hoped. Instead of fighting each other, they began competing to see who could carry the heaviest loads to various points around the camp. Within minutes, the aggressive behavior had transformed into productive activity. The young Corvanx were working together, helping with the evacuation while burning off their excess energy in a way that felt natural to them. Lieutenant Corvin watched this transformation with obvious amazement. "How did you know that would work?" he asked. Marcus shrugged. "Kids are kids. When they're acting out, it usually means they need something: attention, activity, a way to feel useful. You just have to figure out what works for each group, Doctor." Lysandra had been taking notes throughout all of these interactions, her patterns showing intense scientific interest. "Sergeant Chen," she said, "I believe you are demonstrating something that could revolutionize our understanding of child psychology across species. You seem to have an intuitive grasp of what different young beings need." Word of Marcus's successes continued to spread, and soon he found himself dealing with children from species he had never even met before. A group of Miralan empaths whose children were overwhelmed by the emotional chaos of the camp. A family of crystalline beings from the outer rim whose young ones had never seen so many different life forms in one place. Each situation was different, but Marcus found that the same basic principles applied. Listen to what the child was trying to communicate, figure out what they needed: comfort, activity, reassurance, or just someone who understood. Adapt the approach to work with their species' natural behaviors and instincts. As the day progressed, Marcus noticed that other humans in his unit were starting to help. Corporal Sarah Martinez began working with a group of young beings whose parents had been injured in the evacuation. Private David Kim discovered he had a talent for distracting frightened children with simple games that worked across species barriers. The other coalition species watched these developments with growing fascination. What they had initially seen as primitive human behavior, they now began to recognize as something more sophisticated, an advanced form of emotional intelligence that seemed to transcend the normal barriers between species. Commander Vexthara, a senior Threnody officer, approached Marcus as he was helping a young Miralan child who had been separated from her parents. "Sergeant," she said in her precise way, "I have been observing your methods. They appear to violate everything we know about species-specific child psychology." Marcus looked up from the small blue child he was comforting. "Maybe that's the point," he said thoughtfully. "Maybe we've been thinking about this wrong. Instead of focusing on how different we all are, maybe we should be looking at what's the same." The Miralan child in his arms had finally stopped crying and was making the soft humming sounds that indicated contentment in her species. Around them, the evacuation camp was running more smoothly than it had all day. Children who had been problems just hours earlier were now calm, allowing their parents to focus on the practical business of getting to safety. Dr. Lysandra approached with her data tablet, her crystalline skin showing patterns of excitement. "Sergeant Chen, I have been documenting your interactions with 17 different species of children today. The success rate is unprecedented. I believe you may have discovered something fundamental about the nature of childhood itself." Marcus smiled tiredly. "I don't know about that. I just know that scared kids need comfort, bored kids need activity, and all kids need—" The emergency alarm cut through the evening air like a blade. its harsh sound sending panic ripples through the evacuation camp. Marcus looked up from the small group of mixed-species children he had been helping settle down for the night, his heart immediately jumping to high alert. He recognized that particular alarm pattern. It meant the stellar storm had changed course or intensity. Commander Vexithara's voice crackled over the camp's communication system, her normally calm Threnody, pronunciation tight with urgency. All personnel report to designated stations immediately. The stellar storm has accelerated beyond all projections. We have less than 4 hours before it reaches critical intensity. Marcus quickly handed the sleepy Miralyn child he was holding to her mother and jogged toward the command center, where a crowd of officers from various species was already gathering. The large holographic display in the center showed the approaching storm as a massive wall of red and orange energy that dwarfed the entire planet. The situation has become critical, Commander Vexithara announced, her feathers showing the dark patterns of extreme stress. Long-range sensors have detected another refugee camp approximately 200 kilometers to the north. Camp Zeta-7 contains approximately 3,000 civilians, including 800 children. Lieutenant Corvin stepped forward, his massive frame casting shadows across the holographic display. "What is their status?" he rumbled. "They missed their scheduled evacuation window due to equipment failures," the commander replied. "Their transport ships are grounded and they cannot reach our location before the storm hits. We have established communication, but—" She paused, her feathers rippling with obvious distress. "The children in that camp are in a state of panic. The adults cannot organize an effective evacuation because they are overwhelmed trying to manage terrified youngsters from dozens of species." Dr. Lysandra moved closer to the display, her crystalline skin showing rapid patterns of calculation. "What are our options?" she asked. Commander Vexithara's response was grim. "Our transport ships are already at maximum capacity. We cannot delay our own departure or we risk losing everyone here to the storm. The mathematical probability of successfully evacuating both camps is—" She consulted her data tablet. "Less than 12%. A heavy silence fell over the group. Marcus could see the conflict on every face, or the equivalent of faces for non-humanoid species. They were trained to save lives, but the cold mathematics of the situation seemed to offer no good solutions. "What if we could calm the children at the other camp?" Marcus said suddenly, surprising himself with the words. Every eye in the room turned to him. Lieutenant Corvin's mandibles clicked in confusion. "Sergeant Chen, the distance makes that impossible. Even if you could somehow travel there and back, there is insufficient time." "No," Marcus said, his mind racing as an idea began to form. "Not travel there? What if we could help them from here?" Commander Vexithara tilted her head in the precise way that meant a Threnody was processing new information. "Explain." Marcus moved to the communication console, his hands already working on the controls he had learned during his technical training. "We have full communication capability with their camp, right? Audio and visual?" "Yes," the commander confirmed. "But I fail to see how—" "Today I helped children from 17 different species," Marcus interrupted, his excitement growing as the plan took shape in his mind. "Not because I understood their biology or their psychology, but because I could recognize what they needed and respond to it. What if the same techniques could work over a communication link?" Dr. Lysandra's skin patterns shifted to bright, interested colors. "You are suggesting remote child management," she said slowly, "using audio and visual communication to provide comfort and guidance from a distance." "Exactly," Marcus said. "Think about it. Half of what worked today was just sound. The humming for Krythe, the whistling for Pipthyra, the confident voice commands for the Corvanx juveniles. If we could establish a direct link to their camp, maybe we could broadcast calming sounds and guidance that would help settle the children there." A Miralyn officer stepped forward, her blue skin showing skeptical patterns. "But Sergeant, you were physically present for those interactions. The children could see you, feel your emotional intentions. How could that work through a communication system?" Marcus thought about that for a moment. Maybe it's not about physical presence. Maybe it's about consistency and understanding. "When I was working with the kids today, What seemed to matter most was that I was paying attention to them, responding to what they needed. Lieutenant Corvin crossed his forearms, his expression thoughtful, despite his earlier skepticism. It is an unprecedented approach, he admitted, but the alternative is abandoning 3,000 civilians, including 800 children. Commander Vexithara was already moving toward the communication console. Contact Camp Zeta-7 immediately. We need a full assessment of their situation and the species composition of their child population. The main screen flickered and then showed the interior of another evacuation camp. The difference was immediately obvious. Where their own camp had achieved relative order, Camp Zeta-7 was in chaos. Adults of various species were trying to manage children who were clearly terrified and out of control. The sound was overwhelming. A mixture of cries, calls, growls, and other distress sounds from dozens of different young beings. Camp Zeta-7's commander, a tall Threnodi female named Officer Kyle Nara, appeared on the screen. Her feathers were in complete disarray, and her voice showed signs of extreme stress. Commander Vexithara, we are grateful for any assistance, but I do not understand how you can help us from such a distance. Officer Kyle Nara, we are going to attempt something that has never been tried before, Commander Vexithara explained. We have a human specialist who has demonstrated remarkable success with cross-species child management. He believes he can provide guidance remotely. Officer, Kilnara's feathers rippled with what might have been confusion or hope. Any assistance would be welcome. We have children from 23 different species here, and none of our standard protocols are working. The younger ones are feeding off each other's panic. Marcus stepped into view of the camera, feeling suddenly self-conscious about addressing an entire camp of people he had never met. Officer Kylanara, I'm Sergeant Chen. Can you tell me which species are having the most difficulty right now? The Zelani infants have been crying for hours, Officer Kilnara replied immediately. Their distress is affecting the Miralan children, who are becoming emotionally overloaded. The Korvank's juveniles are responding by becoming aggressive, and the Threnodi young ones are making distress calls that are interfering with our communication systems. Marcus nodded, recognizing the pattern. It's a feedback loop. Each species' stress response is making the others worse. He looked back at his own team. Can we set up multiple audio channels? I'll need to address different groups with different approaches. Dr. Lysandra was already working at a secondary console. I can configure separate audio frequencies for each species grouping, she said. But Sergeant, you will need to manage multiple conversations simultaneously. That's where the rest of my team comes in, Marcus said, gesturing to Corporal Martinez and Private Kim, who had been listening from the edge of the group. We've all been working with the children here today. We can handle different species, groups at the same time. Commander Vexithara looked at the chronometer on the main display. You have less than 3 hours before the storm reaches critical intensity, she warned. If this doesn't work quickly, we will have to abandon the attempt and launch our own evacuation. Marcus took a deep breath and moved to the communication console. Through the screen, he could see the chaos at Camp Zeta-7. Frightened children of multiple species creating a cascade of panic that their parents couldn't control. It seemed impossible that voices from 200 kilometers away could make a difference. But as he had learned over the past day, sometimes the most important things were also the simplest ones. Officer Kilnara, Marcus said, his voice taking on the calm, confident tone he had used with frightened children all day. I need you to gather the Zelani families first. Get them as close to your communication console as possible. I'm going to try something. As the adults at Camp Zeta-7 began organizing the families by species, Marcus closed his eyes and tried to remember exactly what had worked with baby Krythe. The gentle humming, the rhythmic tone, the feeling of safety and comfort he had tried to project. When he opened his eyes and began to hum softly into the communication system, he could only hope that the same instincts that had worked face-to-face would somehow carry across the distance to children he had never met. The response was almost immediate. On the screen, he could see Zelani infants beginning to quiet, their crystalline skin shifting to calmer colors. The success gave him confidence to continue, and he gestured for Corporal Martinez to take over a second audio channel to work with the Miralan children. For the next 3 hours, Marcus and his team would discover just how far the universal language of caring could reach. The first hour was the hardest. Marcus found himself humming into the communication system while watching the chaos at Camp Zeta 7 slowly transform into something more manageable. His voice was getting hoarse, but he could see the results. On the main screen, Zelani infants settling into peaceful sleep, their crystalline skin showing the soft patterns of contentment he had learned to recognize. Corporal Martinez had taken over the audio channel for the Miralan children, using the same gentle rhythmic tones that seemed to work across species barriers. Her natural speaking voice was higher than Marcus's, and it seemed to resonate particularly well with the young empaths. Private Kim was working with the Threnody children, whistling soft melodies that gradually calmed their distress calls. "Remarkable," Dr. Lysandra murmured, her skin patterns showing intense fascination as she recorded everything. "The children are responding as if you were physically present. The emotional connection is somehow transmitting through the communication system." Officer Kilnara's voice came through the speakers, filled with amazement. "Sergeant Chen, I cannot believe what I am witnessing. In 30 years of service, I have never seen anything like this. The children are actually falling asleep." But the biggest test came with the Corvanx juveniles. Unlike the other species, they weren't responding to gentle sounds and soothing voices. They were still showing aggressive behavior, pushing each other and making the low growling sounds that indicated they were ready to fight. Marcus switched to his command voice, the same firm tone he had used earlier in the day. "Hey, you young warriors," he called through the communication system. "I hear you think you're tough, but can you prove it without fighting each other?" The response was immediate. The young Corvanx stopped growling and turned toward the speaker, with obvious interest. "I'm going to give you a real challenge," Marcus continued. "Your camp needs to be organized for evacuation. Can you help carry supplies to the transport ships? Can you show the adults what real Corvanx strength looks like?" Within minutes, the aggressive juveniles had transformed into helpful workers, competing with each other to carry the heaviest loads and assist with evacuation preparations. Their natural competitive instincts were channeled into productive activity, instead of destructive fighting. Commander Vexithara monitored the progress from multiple screens, her feathers showing patterns that Marcus was beginning to recognize as amazed respect. "Sergeant Chen, not only are you calming the children, but you are actually improving the efficiency of their evacuation process." The second hour brought new challenges. A group of crystalline beings from the outer rim had children who had never heard human voices before and were initially frightened by the strange sounds. Marcus had to experiment with different tones and rhythms until he found something that resonated with their particular physiology. A family of insectoid aliens presented another puzzle. Their young communicated primarily through vibrations rather than audible sounds. Private Kim solved this problem by tapping rhythmic patterns on the communication console, creating vibrations that somehow transmitted through the system to calm the agitated larvae. "This shouldn't be possible," muttered a Threnody scientist who had joined the group of observers. "You are violating fundamental principles of species-specific psychology." "Maybe the fundamental principles are wrong," Marcus suggested between songs for a group of young beings who resembled walking plants. "Maybe there's something deeper that connects all children, regardless of what species they are." Dr. Lysandra looked up from her data tablet, her crystalline skin showing excitement patterns. "Sergeant, I believe you may be correct. I have been analyzing the neurological responses we are receiving from Camp Zeta 7. Despite the vast differences in brain structure between species, all the children are showing similar patterns when they respond to your interventions." The third hour was when everything came together. The children at Camp Zeta 7 had not only calmed down but had begun helping their parents with evacuation preparations. Young beings who had been terrified and uncontrollable were now working together, carrying supplies and comforting even younger children. "Transport ships are reporting ready for departure," Officer Kyle Nara announced through the communication system. "All families are accounted for, and we are within our launch window." "Sergeant Chen, I do not know how to thank you." Marcus smiled tiredly as he watched the orderly evacuation proceeding on the screen. "Just get everyone to safety," he said. "That's thanks enough." As both camps successfully launched their transport ships ahead of the stellar storm, Marcus found himself surrounded by alien officers and scientists who were all trying to understand what they had witnessed. The questions came from every direction. "How did you know those techniques would work?" asked a Corvank strategic analyst. "What made you think sound could transmit emotional comfort across species barriers?" inquired a Miralan psychologist. "Do you believe this approach could be systematically taught to others?" wondered a Threnody educator. Marcus sat down heavily, suddenly feeling the exhaustion of the long day. "I don't know if I can explain it," he said honestly. "I just did what felt right. What I would do for any scared child." Dr. Lysandra approached, with her data tablet, her skin showing patterns of scientific excitement mixed with something that looked like gratitude. "Sergeant Chen, with your permission, I would like to establish a formal research project to study what happened here today. I believe we have discovered something that could change how the galaxy approaches childcare across species barriers." 6. Months later, Marcus stood in the observation deck of the New Haven Research Station, watching through the large windows as children from dozens of different worlds played together in the station's central park. The sight still amazed him. Young Zelani with crystalline skin playing chase with feathered Threnody children, while small Corvanx juveniles helped Miralan youngsters build elaborate structures from colorful blocks. The Interspecies Child Development Institute had grown from Dr. Lysandra's initial research into a major galactic organization. Scientists from hundreds of worlds had come to study what they now called the human phenomenon, the apparently universal effectiveness of human parenting instincts across species barriers. The research had revealed something profound about the nature of childhood itself. Despite millions of years of separate evolution, intelligent species throughout the galaxy had developed remarkably similar neurological patterns in their young. The need for comfort, security, stimulation, and social connection seemed to transcend biological differences. Humans, having evolved as one of the few species that required extensive parental care for survival, had developed parenting instincts so fundamental and adaptable that they could recognize and respond to these universal childhood needs, regardless of the species involved. Silthera approached, carrying her son Kryth, who was now a healthy toddler, whose crystalline skin showed complex, beautiful patterns. The young Zelani had become something of a celebrity in the scientific community, as the first alien child to thrive under human care techniques. "Marcus," Silthera said, her patterns showing warm colors of friendship and gratitude. "Kryth wanted to show you his new skill." The toddler looked up at Marcus with his multifaceted eyes and began making soft musical sounds. Not the cries of distress from 6 months ago, but a deliberate attempt at human-style humming. It was the same lullaby Marcus had hummed to calm him during the evacuation. "He remembers," Silthera said softly. "Zelani have perfect memory from birth. He will carry the sound of your voice with him for his entire life." Marcus knelt down to the child's level, feeling the same instinctive protectiveness he had experienced that first day. "Hello, little one," he said gently. "You've grown so much." Kryth reached out with small, crystalline hands, and Marcus let the child touch his face with curious fingers. The toddler's skin showed patterns of joy and recognition, and he made happy chirping sounds that seemed to translate across any language barrier. Dr. Lysandra joined them, her own skin showing patterns of scientific satisfaction mixed with personal warmth. "The Institute has received requests from 47 different star systems," she reported. "Colony worlds that are struggling with multi-species integration, space stations with diverse populations, exploration ships with mixed crews and families. They all want to learn human childcare techniques." Marcus stood up, still watching Kryth play with a group of children from 6 different species. "It's not really about techniques," he said thoughtfully. "It's about paying attention. Listening to what children need and responding to it, no matter what they look like or where they come from." A communication alert chimed and Dr. Lysandra consulted her tablet. "Sergeant Chen, we have received a priority message from the Galactic Rim. A newly contacted species has established a colony but they are having difficulties with their children adapting to the new environment. They specifically requested human assistance. Marcus smiled, feeling the familiar surge of purpose that came with knowing he could help. When do we leave? As he prepared for another mission, Marcus reflected on how much had changed since that day on Zerion 7 when a crying alien baby had changed everything. The galaxy had learned that sometimes the greatest strength